Hello and welcome to Grad Dialogue. Today is our executive committee meeting of the Grad board, and it seems like the whole meeting was devoted to the hazard mitigation planning and some of the resiliency, project and everything else. So we're going to talk about the second segment of the show, talking about the resiliency planning. So for that, I have my guest is Stephen Kauffman. Let me read some introduction. Stephen Kauffman is the section chief for infrastructure development and recovery within the vulnerabilities assessment branch at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. That's pretty impressive right there. He has over 30 years of professional experience and has a leadership position on high profile projects, including, are you ready? The World Trade Center investigation, renaissance of building and infrastructure performance following the Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, and resiliency programs at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And now he is with the DHS at the CISA, which is the Department of Homeland Security Office. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
Again, I want to thank you and also the whole team that you brought with you, from Utah to Washington, D.C., and also from Lexington to Grad, and talk to the judges about this project and everything else. So let's kind of start out with that, what is resiliency planning and why it is so important for us to look into those.
Sure. So we think of buildings and infrastructure oftentimes as a collection of assets, but really those assets exist to support human activity, whether it's social activity, economic activity, and they really exist as part of a larger system. Mm-hmm. And so what we try to do with resilience planning is understand the importance of those systems to the social and economic objectives of the region, use that as a way of establishing importance, and think about how those systems function or in an interdependent, connected fashion. And we try to do that in a hazard independent way first, and then as we apply the hazards, understand how the system might respond and try to identify where there are gaps in performance that could have detrimental impacts.
Previously we talked to Nick Grinstead, from FEMA office in the UK about the hazard mitigation plan for Grad, and we got funding for that, and we're going to be working on those things. So how, in layman's term, how would that connect to the resiliency plan?
Sure. So resiliency planning is really a different lens of looking at the community and of buildings and infrastructure. We see resiliency planning as being a means to identify where priorities exist for action. Those priorities may be, solved in terms of direct construction. They may be things that can be solved through things like an administrative policy. And so we see this as informing not only the hazard mitigation plan, where there are specific mitigation projects or actions that can be accomplished, but also perhaps informing other plans. Maybe it's the comprehensive plan that would govern development. It might be land use planning. It could be economic development planning. So we see resilience planning as being a different lens of looking at buildings and infrastructure.
So like in our case, we are an MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization. So the planning we do for the MPO, identifying some of the transportation needs, and infrastructure there. Then we also had the regional water and sewer, agency, which is looking at the water and sewer projects, and then all 7 counties and all that. Then we got the economic development group that looks at the comprehensive economic development strategies to get some federal funds for that too. So you're talking about all those along with some of the human services too that we provide, that kind of working together to see how we get ready to support the hazard mitigation or the disaster or something like that. Is that?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So I'd like to think of it in terms of what are the things that make the community what it is. So, the economic engines that provide not only employment, but also contribute to the tax base. They may have importance outside the region, perhaps nationally, perhaps internationally. Really beginning to think about the function of those assets and what's needed to keep those operational and retain the vitality of the community. You can do that as I said, independent of the hazard, and then as you apply the hazards, which is important to the hazard mitigation planning process, understand where there are gaps and be able to use that information to inform the various plans. So the opportunity for the grad, and one of the things that is attractive to working with grad, is that you have all of those planning processes sort of under one roof. And so hopefully the resilience plan process, as we go through this with you, will be useful to all of your planning efforts.
So really, I think the one thing you mentioned in a comment that people don't realize, this is not just for us to do, how we get prepared for any kind of disaster, but also to take care of the infrastructure and assets that could have a bigger impact on this, nationally too. Like for example, you discussed at the meeting that we got some industrial bays that provide high quality aluminum to the defense industry. If there's a disaster occurs there, that would have an impact on there too. So this kind of more or less take an inventory of what we have and how we need to be ready to kind of protect those things as well.
And why is it important, and who is it important to? And then what is it dependent on to be able to operate? So whether it's water, wastewater, power, communications, transportation systems, all of those things contribute to the ability of that facility to perform its function. And so if we can understand that and understand where those dependency relationships may have other consequences down the road, then that helps the planning process.
You mentioned communication. That's something that we had a kind of tough lesson to learn during some of the past disasters, where the communication would not communicate with the appropriate agencies. Is that something that we could look into that? They also talked about doing all that planning and everything else. We need to have some sort of a group or a maybe a body or something looking into those things, and how that would work.
Sure. So if you look at the infrastructure resilience planning framework, which is what we are going to be implementing here in grad, working with the hazard mitigation planning process, we start with identifying a core team. Those are the people that are going to be responsible for preparing the resilience plan. But the important part is engaging a larger body of stakeholders. Who relies on infrastructure? Who operates the infrastructure? In some cases, maybe it's owned by an investor-owned company. Obviously, the state has an interest because they have assets that run through the area. And so bringing those stakeholders to the table, really understanding why these assets are important, or these systems, where are the priorities? Perhaps you've got emergency facilities that need to operate continually. They're going to be reliant on various infrastructure to be able to perform that function. Really understanding those issues so that you can have a comprehensive understanding of the network, and then use that information to support your planning.
I can see why this is ties directly with the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
Seems like when in the past we used to get funding from DHS doing some disaster planning and working towards the same issues there too. Why grad?
Why grad?
And have you have any other experience in other geographical area about the resiliency planning?
Sure. So I'll start with the why grad question first. This actually grew out of some interest by the Kentucky Department of Emergency Management to try to address repetitive loss issues, primarily due to flooding, and oftentimes involving water systems. The process actually began last year before I came to DHS. But we wanted to tie it to a hazard mitigation planning process in one of the area development districts. The timing was such, one, that grad was due to update their hazard mitigation plan. But more importantly, I think grad has a long history of testing new procedures or processes, being a leader within the Commonwealth on planning. And the idea behind this is to develop a replicable process. So, implement the infrastructure resilience planning framework here, tie it to those other planning processes with the intent of developing an enhanced planning process that can then be replicated throughout the state. And so we see this as benefiting not only GRAD, but the entire state of Kentucky, possibly going beyond. And we've certainly had, we've tied in not only the DHS regional office, we've been working with the Chief of Protective Security and the Protective Security Advisor Network here. We've also been engaged with FEMA Region 4 office. So we've tried to tie in the national agencies that are, or the federal agencies that are involved with mitigation planning.
And it sounds great that you are working in all different areas and all different partners and focusing on GRAD to do this pilot project. This kind of sounds scary too for us because we are not done in that level. We are done in the past, and I think one thing that the time has changed too. After 9/11, the first time happened when the DHS got formed, and we all did some of the planning and everything else. But the technology it changed so much. So we were more concerned about providing security at the water systems, sewer systems, and the bridges and all those things, the power plants. Not as much as cybersecurity. So how would that play in this role, the resiliency plan?
Sure. So obviously, cybersecurity is important because a lot of our infrastructure now is operated by cyber-based systems, and that has benefits. Obviously, it makes our systems in some ways more reliable. It reduces the workload, obviously, for individuals. It also presents some vulnerabilities. Obviously, a cyber failure or cyber attack could lead to a failure in a physical system, and we've obviously seen some of those things in the news. So it's a little bit outside of the work that I do, but certainly cybersecurity is a priority for the agency, and we're certainly working with our counterparts in the agency to look at those issues.
In your mind, Steve, what kind of timing are we talking about? And I know we're going to be, start working on updating our hazard mitigation plans. So will this be kind of hand in hand with that planning? Right.
We're going to talk about that this afternoon in our planning meeting. But the idea is that the infrastructure resilience planning process kind of dovetails with the hazard mitigation planning steps. And so what we hope to do is be able to align carefully and enhance those steps and inform the hazard mitigation process as we go forward. What I want to come out of this with is a couple of end results. The first being to have GRAD now have a more holistic look at the infrastructure systems that are present, how they're connected, what their current or what the objectives are for performance, what the current performance might be if the hazard were to occur today. So you have a baseline. That'll feed into the hazard mitigation plan, but it'll also be information that could go into your other plans as well, where that's appropriate. It's also going to be a way of establishing a baseline that you can measure progress against over time.
I think once if I understand, once we put together infrastructure resiliency planning framework, then we got to use those components on everything else we do too. You can see that should be part of the MPO planning or the water sewer planning, or could be SEDS and everything else.
Right. So I like to think of this as what we want to do is move to where resilience becomes a part of the planning process, regardless of what's being done. So it becomes ingrained in our day-to-day activities, and that can be not only planning, but it can also be in operations, maintenance, repair and replacement.
So I think this is a true approach of connecting the dots.
Yes.
And everything, it affects everything, and again, so now we don't have plans in the silos, but also figure out how we could interconnecting and the impact and everything else. This is it's a great project for us. And now, you mentioned that what you're going to be learned through our experience in a pilot project going to be repetitive or at least implemented to the other part of the state as well.
Yes, and perhaps beyond the state.
Okay. Well, again, so you going another point I got to be worried about. Make sure that we do the quality and then the efficiency that you're expecting of us. And I'm really honored that I have a great staff. We're gonna do that. And I think it's a great in the charge that you've given us not to do this, so we'll do that.
And as I said this morning, you're the experts on Green River Area Development District. We're certainly not. But what we do bring to the table is a way of thinking about infrastructure and its importance to the area. And so hopefully that will be a nice synergistic element, and we'll be able to
well, thank you for being on the show as well. Thank you for coming down to GRAD, and wish you best of luck. I know you got quite a few meetings, back to DC and everything else. We've been talking to Stephen Kauffman. He's the section chief of the Infrastructure Development and Recovery. He's also coming to us, asking us to do a pilot project for the infrastructure resiliency planning framework, involving all the planning avenues in the GRAD region, along with the hazard mitigation plan. So, if you have any questions, call me. Then just wait for a while, and we're going to be having more and more discussion about this whole topic, because this is going to have an impact on everything we do, for every planning facets, along with some of the services we provide in the 7 counties. So again, thank you for watching GRAD Dialogue, and have a great day.